She bought an abandoned mine for $5. Thomas Garrett, who had survived 13 Dakota winters, told her plainly, "You'll freeze, and those children will freeze with you." She had $9, two children, and needed 20 cords of timber she could not cut. On January 12th, 1888, the temperature dropped 74 degrees in 7 hours. But 5 months earlier, Ingrid Maren Lindqvist had never spent a single night underground in her life. The wagon carried everything she owned: 2 trunks of clothing, a cast iron cook stove that weighed more than her daughter, 3 crates of preserved food, and $23 in paper currency, folded inside a tobacco tin she kept against her chest. The children sat on the trunks. Peter, 7 years old, watched the Black Hills rise from the grassland like a dark wall. Britta, 4, slept with her head on her brother's lap. Neither of them understood why they had left Minnesota. Neither of them knew their father was not coming back. The consumption had taken Carl Lindqvist in 11 weeks. The farm had taken 3 days to sell. The buyer paid $40 for the land, the house, and the livestock. He knew a widow with 2 children had no leverage. Ingrid knew it too. She signed the papers and climbed onto the wagon before her voice could break in front of her neighbors. She had heard about the Black Hills from Carl's brother, who had gone west in '84 and sent back one letter before the silence began. The letter said there was gold in the streams and silver in the rocks, and men getting rich every week. The letter did not say what happened to men who found nothing. The letter did not say what the winters did to people who came unprepared. Ingrid Lindqvist was not looking for gold. She was looking for a place where no one knew her name, where no one would watch her children with pity in their eyes, where she could rebuild something from nothing without explaining herself to anyone. The wagon reached Rockerville on the 17th of August, 1887. The town sat in a narrow gulch between 2 ridges thick with ponderosa pine. Ingrid counted 14 buildings on the main street, 3 of them saloons. Miners walked the wooden sidewalks with pickaxes over their shoulders and dust in their beards. A few women moved between the dry goods store and the boarding house, their skirts lifting above the mud. No one looked at the wagon. New arrivals came every week. Most of them left before winter. Ingrid stopped the wagon in front of the general store and climbed down. Her legs ached from 3 days on the bench seat. Her back felt like someone had driven nails into the base of her spine, but she kept her shoulders straight and her face still as she walked through the door. The storekeeper was a thick man with a gray beard and spectacles that sat crooked on his nose. He looked up from his ledger and studied her the way a farmer studies livestock at auction. "Help you?" he asked. "I need to know about claims," Ingrid said. "Mining claims, abandoned ones." The storekeeper's eyebrows rose. He set down his pen and removed his spectacles, cleaning them on his apron with slow, deliberate movements. "You looking to stake a claim, ma'am?" "Looking to buy one. Something already dug. Something with shelter." The storekeeper put his spectacles back on and peered past her, through the window at the wagon where her children sat watching. "Those yours?" "They are." "Husband?" "Dead." The word hung in the air between them. The storekeeper nodded slowly, and something shifted in his expression. Not sympathy exactly. Something more like calculation. "Ma'am, I've seen a heap of folks come through here with stars in their eyes," he said. "Men, mostly. Strong men with money and equipment and partners to share the work. Most of them leave inside a year with nothing but empty pockets and frostbite scars. The ones who stay, some of them strike a vein and get rich. Most of them don't. And the ones who don't." He paused, letting the silence speak. "A widow with 2 children and no husband isn't going to find what she's looking for in a played-out mine." "I'm not looking for gold," Ingrid said. "Then what are you looking for?" She did not answer. The storekeeper watched her for a long moment, then shrugged and reached beneath the counter. He pulled out a ledger, different from the one he had been writing in, and opened it to a page covered in cramped handwriting. "There's maybe a dozen abandoned claims within walking distance of town," he said. "Men who dug for a season, found nothing, gave up, and left without filing abandonment papers. Most of them, the tunnels have collapsed or flooded. A few are still standing." He ran his finger down the page. "There's one about 2 miles west, up on the ridge above Squaw Creek. Fellow named Erickson dug it out in '82. Drove a tunnel maybe 50 feet into the hillside chasing a quartz vein that turned out to be worthless. He built a shack out front, lived there for 2 winters, then walked away when his money ran out, left everything behind." "Is the tunnel still open?" "Far as I know, but ma'am." He leaned forward and his voice dropped. "You don't want to live in a mine tunnel. No one does that. The men who work the big operations, they go down in the morning and come up at night. They don't sleep underground. It isn't natural. What would a claim like that cost?" The storekeeper stared at her. Then he shook his head and wrote something on a scrap of paper. "Erickson owes me $14 for supplies he bought on credit before he disappeared. You want his claim, you pay his debt. I'll sign over whatever rights I've got, which is probably nothing legal, but enough to keep anyone else from bothering you." "I have $23. "Then you'll have 9 left over. That won't get you through winter, not even close." Ingrid took the paper from his hand. The address was written in the same cramped script as the ledger. She folded it and put it in her pocket. "I'll look at it tomorrow," she said. "If it suits, I'll pay you." "Ma'am." The storekeeper's voice stopped her at the door. "You've got maybe 12 weeks until the snow comes. Whatever you're planning to do out there, you'd best do it fast. And you'd best understand something. I've been in these hills since '77. I've seen what winter does to people who aren't ready. It doesn't care if you're a man or a woman. It doesn't care if you've got children. The cold comes and it kills whatever isn't prepared." He paused. "You buy that claim and you don't get ready, and when spring comes they'll find you and those kids frozen in that tunnel like statues. That's not me being cruel, that's me telling you the truth." Ingrid met his eyes. "I understand." She walked out into the August sun, climbed back onto the wagon, and released the brake. "Where are we going?" Peter asked. "To see our new home," Ingrid said. The claim was exactly as the storekeeper described. A narrow trail climbed the ridge west of town, switchbacking through pine forest until it reached a small clearing on the hillside. The shack stood at the edge of the trees, a rough structure of unpeeled logs with a tar paper roof that sagged in the middle and gaps between the timbers wide enough to push a hand through. Behind it, the hillside rose steeply, dark granite spotted with lichen, and in the face of the rock, a black rectangle opened like a mouth. Ingrid walked to the entrance and peered inside. The tunnel was wider than she expected, 4 feet across and maybe 6 feet tall, the walls and ceiling rough-hewn from solid rock. She could see perhaps 15 feet before the darkness swallowed everything. The air that drifted out was cool and damp, like the air from a root cellar. She had spent her childhood on a farm in southern Minnesota. Her father had dug a root cellar beneath the house, 8 feet deep, where they stored potatoes and turnips and canned vegetables through the winter. She remembered how the cellar stayed cool in August and never froze in January. She remembered her father explaining it once, in his patient way. "The earth keeps its own temperature," he had said. "It doesn't know what the weather's doing up above." Ingrid stood at the entrance of the abandoned mine tunnel and felt the cool air on her face and thought about what her father had said. The earth keeps its own temperature. She thought about the shack behind her, with its gaps and its sagging roof and its single window that wouldn't stop a breath of wind. She thought about 12 weeks until snow. She thought about her children, and she began to understand what she might be able to do. The mine foreman's name was Thomas Garrett. He had worked the Black Hills since the Custer expedition opened the region in '74, had survived 13 Dakota winters, and had buried more men than he cared to count. He was 53 years old, built like a barrel, and walked with a permanent limp from a collapsed tunnel that had crushed his left foot in '79. He found Ingrid at the claim 3 days after she bought it, pulling rotted timber from the shack's walls and stacking it in a pile for burning. Her children sat on a blanket nearby, Peter minding his sister while their mother worked. Garrett stood at the edge of the clearing and watched her for a full minute before he spoke. "You the widow who bought Erickson's hole?" Ingrid straightened and pushed her hair back from her forehead. Sweat ran down her face despite the cool mountain air. "I am. Thomas Garrett. I'm foreman at the Lucky Strike, down the valley." He didn't extend his hand. "Word in town is you're planning to live up here." "That's right." "In the shack?" Ingrid glanced at the ruined structure, then back at Garrett. "In the tunnel." Garrett's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. He limped forward until he stood at the mouth of the mine, peering into the darkness the same way Ingrid had done. "Erickson dug maybe 50 feet, he said. "Solid granite the whole way. Chased a quartz vein that pinched out to nothing after 30 feet. He was a fool, but he could swing a hammer. The tunnel's sound." He turned back to face her. "But you're not going to live in it." "Why not?" "Because nobody lives underground. It isn't done. There's a reason God put us on top of the earth instead of inside it." "The earth holds its temperature," Ingrid said. "It's cooler in summer and warmer in winter. I felt it when I walked in. 50 feet into that tunnel, it's going to be the same temperature in January as it is right now." Garrett stared at her. Then he laughed, a short, harsh sound with no humor in it. "Lady, I've been in mines from here to Nevada. I know about underground temperature. The big operations down in Virginia City, the Comstock lode, they measured it proper. Below about 30 feet, it sits right around 50 degrees year-round. Some places warmer than that, where the rock has heat in it." He shook his head. "But knowing that and living in a hole are two different things. You've got children. You can't raise children underground like moles." "I can't raise them dead either," Ingrid said. Garrett's laugh cut off. He looked at the shack, at the rotted timbers, at the gaps that would let every breath of winter wind cut through like knives. "You can't fix that," he said. "Not before the snow, not by yourself. You would need 20 cords of timber, minimum, to rebuild the walls and the roof and cut enough firewood to heat it through winter. A man working alone might manage it. A woman?" He shook his head again. "A woman alone with 2 children isn't going to cut 20 cords of timber in 12 weeks. It can't be done. You'll freeze, and those children will freeze with you." "Then I won't live in the shack." "You can't live in a mine tunnel." "Why not?" Garrett opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. He rubbed the back of his neck with one scarred hand and stared at her like she had spoken in a foreign language. "Because it isn't done," he said finally. "Because people don't do that. Because—" He gestured vaguely at the tunnel entrance. "Because it's not right." "It stays 50 degrees inside that rock," Ingrid said. "You just told me so. 50 degrees, whether it's August or January. 50 degrees when it's 20 below zero on the surface. When the wind is blowing 60 miles an hour and the snow is piling up 6 feet deep, it's still 50 degrees in that tunnel. I don't need 20 cords of timber to survive in 50 degrees. I need blankets and a little firewood for cooking. I need food and water and a way to keep the wind out of the entrance." "You need your head examined." "Maybe, but I'm going to try it anyway." Garrett stood very still for a long moment. Then he turned and looked at her children, Peter watching solemnly, Britta playing with a pine cone in the dirt. You understand what happens if you're wrong, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. You understand that nobody's going to come check on you in the middle of a blizzard, that if something goes wrong up here, you're alone. That nobody in town is going to climb this ridge in January to see if the crazy Norwegian woman and her kids are still alive. Yes. Garrett nodded slowly. Then he turned and limped back toward the trail, his bad foot dragging in the pine needles. Your funeral, lady, he said over his shoulder. And theirs. He disappeared into the trees. Ingrid stood watching the empty trail for a long time after he was gone. Then she turned back to the shack and continued pulling rotted timbers from the walls. The storekeeper, his name was Virgil Hess, refused to extend her credit. I won't carry you on the books for a fool's errand, he said when she came to buy supplies. Pay cash or do without. Ingrid paid cash. $9 for flour, salt pork, dried beans, coffee, candles, matches, and 2 woolen blankets that smelled of cedar from the trunk they had been stored in. The supplies filled 1 crate. She carried it back to the wagon on her shoulder while Hess watched from behind his counter with an expression she couldn't read. She made $7.50 last the first 4 weeks. That was her first lesson in the arithmetic of survival. Every purchase subtracted from a total that could not be replenished. The 75 cents for cooking oil meant she couldn't afford lamp fuel. The 50 cents for needles and thread meant she ate beans without salt pork for 3 days. Peter asked once why they couldn't buy candy like the children in town, and Ingrid explained carefully the difference between wanting and needing. He didn't ask again. The work consumed her. Every day began at first light and ended when the darkness made it impossible to continue. She stripped the usable timber from the shack and sorted it into 2 piles, boards sound enough to use for the tunnel entrance, and scraps too rotted for anything but burning. She pulled nails from the boards and straightened them on a flat rock and saved them in a coffee tin because new nails cost money she didn't have. She dragged pine boughs from the forest floor and laid them inside the tunnel in thick mats, 6 inches deep, then a foot, then 18 inches, creating a bed that lifted her children off the cold rock and insulated them from the earth below. The entrance was the crucial problem. The tunnel opened onto the hillside with nothing to stop the wind. Air flowed in freely, and with it would come snow and freezing drafts that would overwhelm whatever warmth the rock provided. She needed a barrier, not a wall, because a wall would trap the bad air inside, but something that blocked wind and snow while still allowing the tunnel to breathe. She solved it with canvas and timber. The shack's roof had been covered with a double layer of tar paper over wooden boards. The tar paper was useless, crumbling at her touch, but beneath it she found a section of heavy canvas sailcloth that some previous owner had used as moisture barrier. It was stained and dirty, but intact, roughly 8 feet by 10 feet. She stretched this across a frame of salvaged timber, creating a door that could be raised or lowered like a curtain. When lowered, it blocked most of the tunnel entrance while leaving a gap at the top for ventilation. When raised, it let her pass in and out freely. Inside, she built a crude hearth from stones gathered along the creek bed, flat rocks stacked in a circle just large enough to contain a small fire. She positioned it 20 feet from the entrance, where the tunnel floor was relatively flat and the ceiling showed no cracks. The smoke would rise to the ceiling, drift toward the entrance, and exit through the gap above the canvas door. She hoped. She tested it with a small fire on the 3rd day of September. The smoke pooled at the ceiling for a moment, then began to move, slowly at first, then faster as the draft established itself. Within 5 minutes, the air in the tunnel was clear. The fire had raised the temperature from 48 degrees to 56 degrees without visible effort. Ingrid stood in the darkness, watching the flames flicker against the granite walls, and allowed herself a moment of hope. It didn't last. The Reverend Josiah Whitmore came to the claim on the second Sunday in September. He was a tall man, thin as a fence post, with a black coat that hung from his shoulders like a scarecrow's, and a Bible clutched in one hand like a weapon. "Mrs. Lindqvist," he said, standing at the edge of the clearing as if approaching any closer might contaminate him. "I've come to speak with you about your soul." Ingrid was splitting firewood. She had found a dead pine with a trunk thick enough to yield decent fuel, and she had spent 3 days cutting it into rounds with a borrowed saw. Now she was splitting those rounds with a hatchet, the heaviest tool she owned, and stacking the pieces against the hillside near the tunnel entrance. She didn't stop working when the preacher spoke. "My soul is my business, Reverend." "Your soul is God's business, ma'am, and I'm concerned." He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the fallen needles. "Word in town is you're planning to live in that mine shaft, to raise your children underground like animals in a burrow." "Word in town is correct." "That's not how Christian people live, Mrs. Lindqvist. The Lord made the surface of this earth for mankind. He placed us here in the light, under the sky He created, not in holes in the rock like badgers." The Bible rose, pointing at the tunnel entrance. "A Christian home has 4 walls and a door that faces heaven. What you're building here is an abomination." Ingrid drove the hatchet into the splitting stump and straightened. She was breathing hard from the work, and her shoulders ached, and she had a blister on her right palm that would be bleeding again by nightfall. She had no patience for theology. "Reverend, do you know what temperature it is inside that tunnel?" Whitmore blinked. "I don't see what that has to do with 50 degrees, maybe 48. It doesn't change summer or winter. It's the same temperature in there right now as it will be in January when it's 30 below on the surface and your congregation is burning their furniture to stay warm." She gestured at the shack's skeleton, the pile of rotted timber, the stacks of salvaged boards. "I can't rebuild that shack before winter. I can't cut enough firewood to heat it even if I could. So I can either move into that tunnel and keep my children alive, or I can build some respectable Christian home that God approves of and watch my children freeze to death. Which would you prefer?" The Reverend's face had gone pale. He clutched his Bible tighter. There are families in town who might take you in. Christian charity." "Christian charity comes with conditions, Reverend. I know how it works. Someone takes in the poor widow and her children out of the goodness of their heart, and suddenly the widow is cooking and cleaning and mending and has no say in how her children are raised. I've seen it before. I won't do it. Pride is a sin, Mrs. Lindqvist. So is letting children die when you have the means to save them." Ingrid pulled the hatchet from the stump and picked up another round of pine. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." The Reverend stood there for a long moment, his mouth working silently. Then he turned and walked back toward the trail, his black coat flapping in the breeze. "You're making a terrible mistake," he called over his shoulder. "The Lord will judge you for this." Ingrid brought the hatchet down hard. The pine round split cleanly in 2. September became October. The aspen leaves turned gold on the lower slopes and then fell, leaving bare branches that rattled in the wind like bones. The nights grew colder. Frost appeared on the canvas door in the mornings, delicate patterns of ice that melted when the sun hit the hillside. Ingrid counted her supplies and counted the days remaining and did not like the math. She had accumulated maybe a quarter cord of firewood, enough for cooking through the fall, but nowhere near enough for winter. Even with the tunnel's natural warmth, she would need fire for cooking and for the psychological comfort of light and heat in the endless darkness. A quarter cord might last a month if she was careful. After that, she would be burning whatever she could find. Her food stores were adequate, but not generous. She had 20 pounds of flour, 15 pounds of beans, 5 pounds of salt pork, 2 pounds of coffee, and a small amount of sugar and salt. Enough for 3 people for maybe 2 months if she stretched it. After that, she didn't want to think about after that. She had $1.12 in cash. The storekeeper's words echoed in her mind. You'll freeze, and those children will freeze with you. The preacher's words, the foreman's words. Everyone said the same thing, and the numbers seemed to prove them right. But the tunnel stayed 50 degrees. She tested it every day, pressing her palm against the granite walls deep inside, feeling the rock's steady temperature. She built small fires and measured how quickly the space warmed, how slowly it cooled. She timed how long it took for the air to clear after she extinguished the flames. She tracked the humidity, noting that the rock face at the very end of the tunnel seeped moisture that collected in a natural depression, drinking water if she needed it. The tunnel was dry enough to sleep in, warm enough to survive in, stable enough to trust. Everything she observed confirmed her theory. The earth would protect them, but no one in town believed it would work. The help came unexpectedly, and it came disguised. Old Marcus Treadwell ran a small sawmill on the creek below town. He was 72 years old, stooped and thin, with hands like leather gloves and eyes that had seen everything the Black Hills could offer and survived it. His wife had died in 79, and his son had left for California in 83, and he lived alone in a cabin next to his mill, cutting timber for the mines and the houses that miners built. He appeared at the claim on a Tuesday morning in late October, leading a mule cart stacked with milled lumber, 2x4s and 1x6s, clean and straight and freshly cut. I heard you needed building materials, he said without preamble. Ingrid stared at the cart. There was easily $100 worth of lumber on it, more money than she would see in a year. I can't pay for that. Didn't ask you to. Treadwell climbed down from the cart with the careful movements of a man whose joints no longer cooperated. Your boy, the older one, Peter, he's been coming down to the mill to watch me work. Smart kid, good with his hands. He helped me stack some boards last week, didn't ask for nothing in return. Ingrid looked at her son, who had come out of the tunnel at the sound of the cart. Peter's face was red. You didn't tell me you went to the mill, she said. I didn't want you to worry. Peter's voice was small. I just wanted to see how the saw worked. Treadwell waved his hand. Kid's no trouble, quiet, does what he's told, doesn't get in the way. Rare qualities in a 7-year-old. He began unloading the lumber, stacking it near the tunnel entrance. Consider this a trade. Your boy's labor for lumber you can use. Makes us even. That's not a fair trade. Lady, I'm 72 years old, and I've been cheating people in business deals since before you were born. I think I know what's fair. He straightened and fixed her with a look that dared her to argue. You need this lumber to build a proper entrance for that tunnel. Something stronger than canvas and scrap wood. Something that'll keep the wind out and the heat in and not fall apart in the first blizzard. I need someone to help me around the mill now and then. We both get what we need. That's the definition of fair. Ingrid stood silent for a long moment. Her pride warred with her necessity. Pride lost. Thank you, she said. Treadwell grunted. Don't thank me yet. I'm not saying your plan will work. Half the town thinks you're crazy, and the other half thinks you're going to be dead by February. But I figure if you're going to try something stupid, you might as well do it right. He finished unloading the lumber and climbed back onto the cart. One more thing, he said. The foreman, Garrett, he came by the mill last week, asked about you, wanted to know if I'd talked to you, what I thought of your chances. What did you tell him? Treadwell shrugged. Told him I've seen stranger things work and safer things fail. told him this country has a way of killing the prepared and saving the foolish, told him nobody knows what's going to happen until it happens. He picked up the reins. He didn't like that answer. Men like Garrett, they want certainty. They want to know they're right. You being up here, doing what you're doing, it bothers him. It's not how things are supposed to work. I don't care about how things are supposed to work. No. Treadwell smiled the first time she had seen him smile. I don't expect you do. He clicked to the mule, and the cart began to move down the trail. Ingrid watched until he disappeared around the first switchback. Then she turned to the stack of lumber and began calculating what she could build with it. November came with the first real cold. The temperature dropped below freezing and stayed there. Ice formed on the creek, thin at first, then thicker. Snow fell twice in the first week, light dustings that melted by noon, and then again on the 10th, harder this time, accumulating 3 inches on the ground before stopping. Ingrid worked faster now. The lumber from Treadwell let her build a proper entrance structure, a timber frame set into the rock at the tunnel's mouth, with boards nailed tight across the top and sides, and a heavy wooden door that swung on leather hinges. The door had gaps around its edges. She couldn't eliminate them completely, but the gaps were small enough to block most of the wind. She stuffed them with rags and pine needles and dried grass, creating seals that would hold until spring. Inside, she expanded the living space. More pine boughs for bedding, a raised platform of scrap wood to keep their supplies off the damp floor, niches carved into the granite walls to hold candles and small items, a simple wooden frame strung with rope to serve as shelving. The tunnel took shape around her. Not comfortable, comfort was a luxury she couldn't afford, but functional, a place where 3 people could survive. Peter helped where he could. He carried stones for the hearth and gathered pine boughs for bedding and kept Britta entertained while their mother worked. He was 7 years old and had grown up fast since his father died. Too fast. Ingrid watched him sometimes and saw a child trying to be a man because he thought his family needed him to be. It broke her heart and filled her with pride in equal measure. Britta didn't understand what was happening. She was 4. She played in the tunnel entrance during the day and slept curled against her brother at night, and asked sometimes why they lived in a cave now instead of a house. Ingrid told her it was an adventure. She hoped Britta was too young to sense the fear beneath the word. The supplies dwindled, the days grew shorter, the temperature dropped lower with each passing week. By mid-November, the nights were reaching 10 degrees below zero on the surface. Inside the tunnel, 50 feet from the entrance, it was still 48 degrees. Ingrid checked it every night before she slept, pressing her hand against the rock wall, feeling the earth's stored warmth against her palm. The skeptics in town were waiting. She knew they were. Garrett, who had told her she would freeze. The Reverend, who had called her home an abomination. Hess, the storekeeper, who had refused her credit. They were all waiting to see her fail, to see her come staggering into town in January with frostbitten children and admit that they had been right all along. She would not give them that satisfaction. She would survive this winter or die trying. And she was beginning to believe, against all the evidence, against all the warnings, against everything the math said was possible, that she might actually survive. The weather report came down from the Signal Corps station in Huron on the afternoon of January 11th, 1888. Temperatures would be warm over the next several days, unseasonably warm. A low-pressure system was moving through the region, bringing mild air from the southwest. Highs might reach the upper 30s, possibly the 40s. A pleasant break from the brutal cold that had gripped Dakota Territory since November. In Rockerville, people stepped outside without their heavy coats for the first time in weeks. Children played in streets that had been deserted for months. Miners walked to work without wrapping scarves around their faces. The sun shone warm and bright, and everyone agreed it felt like spring. 2 miles up the ridge, in the tunnel she had made her home, Ingrid Lindqvist noticed none of this. She was dealing with a crisis of her own. Britta had fallen sick 4 days earlier. It started as a cough, dry and persistent, worse at night. Then came the fever, then the lethargy. The little girl lying on the pine bough bed, with her eyes half closed and her skin burning to the touch. Ingrid knew the symptoms. She had seen them before in Minnesota, when diphtheria swept through the farming communities and killed children by the dozen. She didn't know if this was diphtheria. She didn't know what medicine to use or what treatment might help. All she knew was that her daughter was sick and getting sicker, and there was nothing she could do about it. She kept Britta warm. She kept water nearby and made her drink when she was conscious. She bathed her forehead with cool rags to bring down the fever. She did everything she knew how to do, and it wasn't enough. Peter watched from the corner of the tunnel with wide eyes. He didn't ask if his sister was going to die. He didn't have to. On the morning of January 12th, the temperature inside the tunnel was 49 degrees. Britta's fever was 103. Outside, the sun was shining, and the thermometer in town read 40 degrees, and people were talking about what a beautiful day it was. Ingrid didn't know about any of that. She was deep in the tunnel, holding her daughter's hand, listening to her breathe. She didn't see the black wall of cloud rising on the northwestern horizon. She didn't know that in 3 hours the temperature would drop 55 degrees. She didn't know that by nightfall the blizzard would be killing everyone it could reach. But the storm was coming anyway. The morning of January 12th had been the warmest day in weeks. By 2 in the afternoon, the temperature in Rockerville stood at 44 degrees. Children who had been kept indoors for months played in the muddy streets. Miners worked without gloves. The owner of the general store, Virgil Hess, propped open his front door to let the mild air circulate through the building. At 2:30, someone noticed the cloud. It rose on the northwestern horizon like a wall, not white, not gray, but black. Coal black. The color of a bruise spreading across the sky. It stretched from one edge of the horizon to the other, and it was moving fast, faster than a horse could run, faster than anyone had ever seen weather move before. The temperature began to drop, 44 degrees at 2 o'clock, 38 degrees at 2:15, 29 degrees at 2:30. The numbers fell like stones dropped into a well, each one disappearing into darkness before the next one followed. At 2:45, the wall hit Rockerville. The wind came first, a blast of Arctic air that slammed into buildings and tore shingles from roofs and knocked grown men off their feet. Then came the snow. Not the fat, lazy flakes of a normal snowstorm, but something different, something worse. The snow was fine as flour, sharp as ground glass, and so thick that visibility dropped to 0 in seconds. A man standing in the street could not see his own hand in front of his face. The temperature kept falling. 20 degrees. 15, 10, 5, 0. The thermometer at the general store, the one Hess checked every morning and every evening, stopped working when it hit 10 below. The mercury had contracted so far that it could no longer move. By nightfall, the temperature in Rockerville was 30 degrees below 0. The wind was blowing at 60 miles per hour. The wind chill, though no one used that term in 1888, was somewhere around 70 below. People died. They died in the streets, caught between buildings with nowhere to go. They died in their homes when the fires went out and the wood ran out and the cold crept in through every crack and gap. They died in barns searching for livestock that had already frozen. They died in schoolhouses and churches and general stores and anywhere else the blizzard found them unprepared. And 2 miles up the ridge, in a tunnel carved into the Black Hills granite, Ingrid Lindqvist heard nothing but silence. The storm reached the claim at 3 o'clock, but Ingrid didn't know it. She was 50 feet inside the tunnel, sitting beside her daughter, watching Britta's chest rise and fall with each shallow breath. The fever had broken slightly around noon, 101 instead of 103, and Ingrid had allowed herself a moment of hope. But now Britta was sleeping again, her face pale and damp, and the hope felt fragile. Peter sat on the other side of the pine bough bed, his knees drawn up to his chest. He hadn't spoken in hours. He just watched his sister breathe, counting each breath the way Ingrid did, terrified of what it would mean when the breathing stopped. The sound reached them as a low moan, distant at first, like wind moving through trees far away. Then louder still. The moan became a roar, and the roar became a scream, and suddenly the tunnel was filled with the sound of something vast and furious trying to tear its way inside. Ingrid scrambled to her feet and ran toward the entrance. The timber door she had built, the one with the gaps stuffed with rags and pine needles, the one she had been so proud of, was shaking in its frame. Snow was blasting through every crack, filling the air with white powder, coating the walls and floor with a layer of ice. The roar was deafening. She could barely hear her own thoughts. She threw her weight against the door, pressing it closed, but the wind pushed back harder. The gaps she had stuffed were blowing open, the rags tearing free, the pine needles scattering like chaff. Cold air poured through, not 50-degree air from the tunnel, but air so cold it burned her lungs when she breathed. "Peter!" she screamed. "Bring the blankets!" Her son appeared beside her, dragging 2 wool blankets through the snow that was already accumulating on the tunnel floor. Together they pressed the blankets against the door, stuffing them into the gaps, wedging them tight with pieces of firewood and loose stones. The roar dimmed slightly. The snow stopped blasting through, but the cold had already invaded. Ingrid pressed her palm against the tunnel wall, 20 feet from the entrance. The rock was cold, not the steady 48 degrees she had come to trust, but cold, genuinely cold, 35 degrees, maybe 30. The Arctic air had pushed deep into the tunnel before she could stop it, displacing the Earth's warmth, turning her shelter into something dangerously close to a trap. She grabbed Peter's hand and pulled him back toward the rear of the tunnel, where Britta lay on the bed of pine boughs. The air here was warmer, 40 degrees, maybe 42, but it wouldn't stay that way if she didn't act fast. She built a fire. Not a cooking fire, small and conservative, the kind she had been building for months to stretch her meager fuel supply. This was a survival fire, every piece of wood she had left piled into the stone hearth and lit with shaking hands. The flames rose high, throwing wild shadows on the granite walls, filling the tunnel with light and heat and the smell of burning pine. The temperature began to climb, 45 degrees, 48, 50. The rock walls absorbed the heat and held it, radiating warmth back into the enclosed space. The thermal mass that had kept the tunnel cool in summer was now keeping it warm in winter, storing the fire's energy in thousands of pounds of granite that would release it slowly over hours. Ingrid sat between her children and watched the fire burn and listened to the storm scream outside and tried not to think about how much wood she had left. Not enough. She already knew it wasn't enough. The first night was the worst. The blizzard howled without pause, a constant shriek of wind that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Snow piled against the tunnel entrance, pressing against the door, trying to force its way inside. The temperature outside dropped to 40 below zero, then 45 below, then lower still. Numbers that didn't seem real, numbers that killed. Inside the tunnel, Ingrid kept the fire burning. She rationed the wood as carefully as she could, enough to maintain warmth, not enough to waste. The rock walls helped. They absorbed heat during the peaks and released it during the lulls, smoothing out the temperature fluctuations, keeping the space livable even when the fire burned low. At the rear of the tunnel, 50 feet from the entrance, the temperature held steady at 52 degrees. 52 degrees while the world outside was 50 below. 100-degree difference. The earth was keeping its promise. But Britta was getting worse. The fever spiked again around midnight, 104 degrees now, higher than before. Her breathing had become labored, a wet rattle in her chest that made Ingrid's heart clench every time she heard it. She didn't know what to do. She had no medicine, no doctor, no help of any kind. All she could do was keep her daughter warm and hope that warmth would be enough. Peter refused to sleep. He sat beside his sister with his hand on her forehead, checking her temperature the way Ingrid had taught him, announcing the numbers in a voice that grew smaller with each hour. "She's still hot, Mama." "I know, sweetheart." "Is she going to die?" Ingrid couldn't answer. She pulled her son close and held him against her chest and listened to the storm and the fire and her daughter's labored breathing, and she prayed to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. The night stretched forever. Dawn came, but no one could tell. The blizzard had not stopped. If anything, it had grown stronger. The snow was falling so thick that even the faint light of morning couldn't penetrate the clouds. Outside the tunnel, the world was darkness and wind and cold that killed anything it touched. Ingrid's wood supply was half gone. She had started with maybe 20 pieces of split pine, enough for 2 days of normal cooking fires, she had thought. But this was not normal. This fire had to burn constantly, had to fight against the cold that kept trying to invade from the entrance, had to keep 3 people alive in conditions that should have killed them already. 20 pieces of wood had become 10 overnight. By tomorrow, there would be nothing left. She made a decision. The timber frame she had built around the entrance, the one that held the door in place, the one made from Treadwell's milled lumber, was fuel. The wooden platform she had built for storage was fuel. The makeshift shelving, the bed frame Peter slept on, the handle of her hatchet. Everything that could burn would burn if it came to that. The tunnel would protect them. The rock would hold the heat. All she had to do was keep feeding the fire. She began breaking apart the storage platform, pulling the boards free one by one, stacking them near the hearth. Peter helped without being asked. Neither of them spoke about what it meant, that their supplies were now sitting on the bare rock floor, that they were burning the infrastructure of their survival to stay alive one more hour, one more day. Britta's fever broke just before noon. It happened suddenly, without warning. One moment her forehead was burning to the touch, and the next it was merely warm. Her breathing eased. Her color improved. She opened her eyes and looked at her mother and said, in a voice weak but clear, "I'm thirsty." Ingrid cried. She didn't mean to. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry in front of her children, wouldn't show them how frightened she was, wouldn't let them see the doubt that had been eating at her for months. But the tears came anyway, running down her cheeks and dripping onto Britta's blanket while Peter stood beside her with his hand on her shoulder and said, "It's okay, Mama. It's okay." She gave Britta water from the seepage collected at the rear of the tunnel, cold and clean and tasting of minerals. She gave her a small piece of salt pork, softened in warm water until it was almost mush. She propped her daughter up on the pine bough bed and watched her eat and drink and slowly returned to something like herself. The fever had broken. Her daughter was going to live. Now she just had to keep all of them alive long enough for the storm to end. The blizzard lasted 6 days. 6 days of wind that never stopped screaming. 6 days of snow that piled higher and higher against the tunnel entrance until the door was completely buried, and the only light came from the fire and the candles Ingrid had saved for emergencies. 6 days of cold that would have killed them 100 times over if they had been anywhere else. Ingrid burned everything. The storage platform went first, then the bed frame, then the shelving. She burned the handle of her hatchet and the frame of her cook stove crate and the boards from the shack's roof that she had been saving for repairs. She burned the wooden bucket she used for water and the crate that had held her supplies and anything else that would catch flame. By the fourth day, she was burning the door frame itself. The irony wasn't lost on her. The entrance she had built so carefully, the barrier that was supposed to protect them from the storm, was now being fed piece by piece into the fire that was actually keeping them alive. The door still stood, wedged in place by snow and ice, but the frame around it was disappearing one board at a time. The temperature inside the tunnel never dropped below 48 degrees. She checked it obsessively, pressing her palm against the rock walls at the rear of the tunnel, feeling the earth's stored warmth against her skin. The granite held steady. The thermal mass that had seemed so abstract when she first learned about it was now the only thing standing between her family and death. 50 feet of solid rock, millions of pounds of stone that had absorbed the summer's heat and was releasing it now, degree by degree, into the space where her children slept. On the fifth day, she heard voices. At first, she thought she was hallucinating. The isolation and the stress and the constant fear had worn her down to something barely human. She hadn't slept more than an hour at a time since the storm began. She had eaten almost nothing, saving the food for Peter and Britta. Her hands shook when she tried to hold things. Her vision blurred at the edges. But the voices were real. They came from outside the tunnel, muffled by snow and wind, but unmistakably human. Someone was calling her name. Someone was digging. Ingrid scrambled toward the entrance, toward the door that was now half buried under 6 feet of snow. She pressed her face against the gap at the top, the only opening that remained, and shouted back, "We're here! We're alive!" The digging intensified. She could hear shovels biting into packed snow, could hear men grunting with effort, could hear someone saying, keep going, she's in there." 20 minutes later, a shaft of gray light appeared above the door. A face filled the opening, bearded, frostbitten, exhausted. It was Thomas Garrett. The foreman didn't say anything at first. He just stared at her through the gap in the snow, his eyes taking in the tunnel behind her, the fire still burning in its stone hearth, the children wrapped in blankets near the rear, the air that was warm enough to fog his frozen breath. "You're alive," he said finally. "We're alive." Garrett shook his head slowly. His face was unreadable. "The whole town thought you were dead. When the storm hit, someone said there was a widow with children up on the ridge, and everyone figured—" He stopped. "We couldn't get here until now. The drifts are 12 feet deep in places. Took us 4 hours to dig up from the creek. Is it over, the storm?" "Mostly. Still cold as hell, but the wind died down this morning." He paused. "Mrs. Lindqvist, it's been 40 below for 5 days straight. The Hendersons lost their whole family, all 5 of them, frozen in their cabin when the fire went out. Old man Treadwell barely made it. The Reverend Whitmore has frostbite on both feet. Might lose them." Another pause. "How in God's name did you survive up here?" Ingrid stepped back from the door, letting Garrett see the full length of the tunnel behind her. The fire, the rock walls, the space that had stayed warm while the world outside was dying. "The earth keeps its own temperature," she said. "It doesn't know what the weather's doing up above." Garrett stared at her for a long moment. Then he began to laugh. It wasn't a mocking laugh. It wasn't the harsh bark he had given her back in August when she first explained her plan. This was something else, disbelief mixed with something that might have been admiration. "Son of a bitch," he said. "It actually worked." The town came to see. Over the following week, as the drift slowly compacted and the temperatures grudgingly climbed back towards survivable, a steady stream of visitors made the trek up the ridge to Ingrid Lindqvist's claim. They came with questions. They came with doubt. They came because they had heard a widow and two children had survived 6 days of 40 below temperatures in a mine tunnel with almost no firewood, and they needed to see it for themselves. Virgil Hess came on the second day after the storm broke. He stood at the entrance of the tunnel and stared at the interior for a long time without speaking. His face was pale, paler than usual, and his hands were wrapped in bandages. He had lost 2 fingers to frostbite on the night of January 12th, caught outside between his store and his house when the blizzard hit. "I said you'd freeze," he said quietly. "I said those children would freeze with you. You did. I was wrong." The words came out like they cost him something. "I've lived in these hills for 11 years. I thought I knew what was possible and what wasn't. I thought—" He stopped and shook his head. "I was wrong." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to Ingrid without meeting her eyes. "Your account at the store," he said. "Whatever you need for as long as you need it. No payment required. Consider it an apology." Ingrid unfolded the paper. It was a credit voucher, made out in her name with no limit specified. She looked up at Hess, but the storekeeper was already walking back down the trail. Thomas Garrett came again on the 4th day. This time he brought 2 other men from the Lucky Strike, miners who had worked underground for years and understood the principles Ingrid had relied upon. "We measured the temperature at the back of your tunnel," Garrett said. 49 degrees, right in the middle of a week where the surface never got above 20 below. 100-degree difference. He shook his head. "I've known about underground temperature my whole career. Every miner knows it, but I never thought about using it like this. I never thought—" He stopped and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You're a hell of a lot smarter than I gave you credit for, Mrs. Lindqvist." "I'm a mother who didn't want her children to die." "That, too." Garrett pulled off his cap and held it in his hands. "I owe you an apology. I told you this couldn't work. I told you that you and your kids would freeze. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. You were trying to protect us, in your own way. Maybe, but I was still wrong." He put his cap back on and gestured to the other miners. "These boys want to know how you set up the entrance, how you managed the ventilation, how you kept the fire from smoking out the space. They're thinking maybe there's something to this idea. Maybe if there's another storm like that one, people don't have to die in their houses. Maybe they can dig in and survive." Ingrid showed them. She walked them through the tunnel, explaining the principles she had figured out through trial and error over the long months of preparation. The importance of depth, at least 30 feet to reach stable temperatures. The necessity of ventilation, a gap at the top of any entrance to let smoke and stale air escape. The value of thermal mass, how the rock stored heat and released it slowly, smoothing out temperature fluctuations that would kill you in a surface structure. The fire placement far enough inside to benefit from the rock's insulation, close enough to the entrance to vent properly. The miners listened. They asked questions. They took notes on scraps of paper with pencil stubs pulled from their pockets. Word spread. "Sir, by the end of January, 3 other families in Rockerville had begun modifying abandoned prospect tunnels for emergency shelter. By February, the number had grown to 7. A miner named Patterson, who had a wife and 4 children in a drafty cabin on the edge of town, spent 2 weeks deepening an old prospect hole behind his property and building a proper entrance with a ventilated door. Another family, the Sorensens, cleaned out a collapsed section of tunnel near Squaw Creek and reinforced it with timber salvaged from an abandoned stamp mill. None of them planned to live underground permanently. That wasn't the point. The point was survival. The point was having somewhere to go when the next blizzard came, a place where the Earth's constant temperature could keep you alive when everything above ground was trying to kill you. Ingrid shared her knowledge freely. She showed anyone who asked how to assess a tunnel for stability, how to build an entrance that blocked wind while allowing ventilation, how to position a fire for maximum heat retention. She drew diagrams in the dirt and answered the same questions over and over and never charged a penny for any of it. "Why don't you ask for payment?" Thomas Garrett asked her one afternoon, watching her explain ventilation principles to a young couple who had just arrived from Minnesota. "You could make money from this. People would pay." "Would you have paid?" Ingrid asked. "Back in August when you thought I was crazy?" Garrett considered the question. "No, I suppose not." "Then why would I ask for payment now? The knowledge is only valuable if people use it. They won't use it if it costs them money they don't have." The Reverend Josiah Whitmore did not come to see the tunnel. He had lost both feet to frostbite on the night of January 12th, caught between the church and his house when the blizzard struck. The doctor in town, such as he was, had amputated below the knees to save his life. He spent the rest of that winter in a bed at the boarding house, tended by the same women whose souls he had tried to save. Someone told Ingrid that he had asked about her, that he had wanted to know if the rumors were true, if the widow on the ridge had really survived by living underground like an animal. Someone told her that when he heard the answer, he had turned his face to the wall and said nothing for 3 days. She did not go to see him. She did not know what she would say if she did. Ingrid Lindqvist remained on her claim for 11 more years. She never struck gold. The tunnel that Erickson had dug remained as worthless for mining as it had been when she bought it. But the claim itself had value now, not for what lay in the rock, but for the shelter the rock provided. She expanded the living space over the following summers, extending the tunnel another 30 feet and carving out small chambers for storage and sleeping. She built a proper cabin at the entrance, using the skills she had learned during that desperate first summer, and she split her time between the surface structure and the underground refuge, depending on the season and the weather. Peter grew up on the claim. He learned to read from books Ingrid bought with credit at Hess's store, and he learned to work from the miners who came to study his mother's survival techniques. At 14, he got a job at the Lucky Strike, working above ground at first, then below. At 19, he married a girl from Deadwood and built a house on the creek below his mother's property. He never forgot the winter of 1888. He never stopped checking underground temperature readings before a storm. Britta survived her childhood illness with no lasting effects. She grew into a quiet, serious girl who preferred books to people and solitude to company, traits that served her well on the isolated claim. At 16, she left for Rapid City to attend a school for young women. At 20, she was teaching in a one-room schoolhouse near Sturgis. She wrote to her mother every week until the letters stopped coming. Ingrid died in 1901 at the age of 53. The cause was listed as pneumonia, but the people who knew her said she had simply worn out, that the hard years had taken more from her body than anyone realized, and that she had finally run out of the stubbornness that had kept her going. They buried her on the ridge near the entrance to the tunnel that had saved her life. The grave marker was granite, cut from the same rock that had sheltered her family through the worst winter in Dakota history. The tunnel is still there. On January 12th, 1888, the temperature in the Black Hills dropped from 44 degrees to 30 below zero in 7 hours. The wind blew at 60 miles per hour. The snow fell so thick that people suffocated standing upright with their eyes open. 235 people died across Dakota Territory, Nebraska, and Minnesota. Most of them were children. Most of them froze in buildings that should have protected them, buildings with walls and roofs and doors that faced heaven. buildings that the cold invaded and killed everyone inside. Thomas Garrett, who had survived 13 Dakota winters, had told Ingrid Lindqvist that her plan was impossible. A woman alone with 2 children isn't going to survive underground, he had said. You'll freeze, and those children will freeze with you. He was wrong. 50 feet inside the Black Hills granite, the temperature never dropped below 48 degrees. The rock held the Earth's warmth the way a mother holds a child, steady, patient, unshakable. The storm screamed above. The cold killed everything it touched. And in the darkness of an abandoned mine tunnel, a widow and her 2 children waited for the world to stop trying to murder them. When the storm finally ended, Ingrid Lindqvist walked out of the tunnel and into the pale winter sunlight. Her daughter was recovering. Her son was beside her. The fire had burned down to embers, and they had eaten the last of the salt pork, and she had exactly no money and no idea what came next. But she was alive. Her children were alive. The earth had kept its promise. She stood at the entrance of the tunnel and looked out at the frozen world and breathed air that was cold enough to hurt, and thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. The farm in Minnesota, the husband who died, the wagon journey west, the storekeeper's warning, the foreman's doubt, the preacher's condemnation, all of them wrong, all of them certain, all of them waiting for her to fail. Ingrid Lindqvist smiled. Then she turned and walked back inside where the earth was warm.